Well, we're still working on this series on track plans, and today I want to talk about stub-ended yards. For purposes of our discussion, we're going to talk about 4 different kinds of yards that we use on our model railroads, and I think pretty much mirroring what goes on in the real world in terms of railroad switching yards. First up is the classification yard, and this is very much like what they do in the real world, where they bring in the different freight cars that are going to different destinations and actually build those up into trains ready to head out on the high iron for their destination. Most commonly, this would be a double-ended yard with a ladder track at either end, so you have access to the main line. You can pull trains into the yard and then right back out of the yard from the double-ended yard. Sometimes the classification yard is stub-ended, that the tracks just go in there and end, so you have to push trains in and then pull them back out. Makes classification much more difficult. The switching is much more difficult if it's a stub-ended yard that way. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, are stub-ended yards. But what we often use a stub-ended yard for, and what I've used a stub-ended yard for on my model railroads, is to use it as a storage yard. On real railroads, it seems when they have a bunch of equipment that they want to store, there may simply be a track inside a large classification yard where they simply stick stuff that they're not going to be using, and a lot of times right out on the main line on some passing track that they're not using, you'll see a whole string of gondola cars or something like that they're not using. Any place to just stick stuff that they're not using, and what better than some unused passing track 40 miles from nowhere. With our model railroads, a storage yard has a completely different function. It's just where we're going to park our stuff while we're not using it. Quite often that storage yard just ends up being a shelf somewhere in the layout room, and you put all your blue box Athearn cars up there and 5-finger them out of there and put them on the track when you want to use them. Much more interesting to just have them in a storage yard somewhere where you can just tag onto them with a locomotive and head out onto the layout. Now, something that you'll find on a lot of layouts that you would not find on a real railroad is a staging yard. And some of my favorite railroads, like Ralph Gochner's railroad, down underneath the layout where you can't actually see it, are perhaps 10 tracks with 10 built-up trains on them. And whenever you want to run one of those trains, you just align the switches, put power to that particular track, or assign it a DCC address or whatever you're going to do, and just pull that thing out and run it. Needless to say, a staging yard has to be double-ended, but it doesn't have to have any other kinds of yard functions. It's simply a yard where you can pull in from one end, park the train until you want to run it again, align the switches, and pull out from the other end and head out onto the main line. Now, my favorite kind of yard to model is the junkyard. This can contain old, worn-out Model A's and Model T's, and a beautiful little wooden shack for Ratfink to live in, and old railroad cars, and boy, who knows what you might find in a junkyard. That's what makes them so fun to model. But today we're going to be talking about stub-ended storage yards. They can be used as a classification yard, but quite often on a model railroad, we're just looking for some place to park all of our blue box Athearns, and we don't have a lot of space to do it, and so having a double-ended yard takes up a lot of space. So we'll simply create a single-ended stub yard and park stuff in there. Now, I've mentioned before that with a few exceptions, this represents my first 3 model railroads. Not quite exactly this track plan, but variations on the thing. A 4x8 sheet of plywood with a couple of ovals on it, and crossover points so you can get from one oval to the other. And I had an enormous amount of fun running my trains around here, except over time, as always, my favorite thing to do is build stuff. And so the whole middle of this thing was structured, but I also had, I don't know, 30, 40 blue box Athearn cars sitting on shelves that I would have to take down and set on the track and set a locomotive on there and run it. Now, I was pretty sophisticated at this time. By now, I was like, I don't know, 13 years old. So, with my mother's assistance, I went out and got another 4x8 sheet of plywood and just tagged it on to the end of my railroad and said, now I've got this huge piece of real estate where I can build some tracks and just store all of my cars so that when I want to run them, I can just pull them out onto the oval and go around in circles. So I built this stub-ended yard with a ladder track. I thought it was very sophisticated. I was actually able to fit, as I recall, 12 tracks across here. So it was bigger than what you see. And I thought, man, this is so cool. But it immediately occurred to me that I'd created something very, very, very special, and that I should probably contact the Guinness Book of World Records and see if they had any interest in documenting this, because I had in fact created the world's worst track plan. So let's talk just briefly here about what makes this so horrible. A lot of times the best way to understand what a thing needs to be is to look at something which is an abysmal failure and say, well, mental note to self, don't do that. So first problem, if I were to pull a train in here, say I'm going around the oval in a clockwise direction and I just pull my train in here onto any one of these tracks, the locomotive is now trapped at the far end of the track, and if I want to run the train again, the best I can hope to do is just back it back out onto the oval and then go around the Circus Maximus over there for a little while and then pull back into the yard, thereby trapping my locomotive again. So the only way out of here is to back out again. So functionally, the best I can hope to do is run around my ovals over here in a counterclockwise direction. And then when I want to store a train for a while, I can back it into the yard and back it down the ladder track and stick some of the cars in whichever storage track I want to, and still pull the locomotive out and put that somewhere else. But only if I'm running around my oval in a counterclockwise direction. So that's pretty silly and very limiting. Now, another problem which might not be immediately obvious is, let's say I've got two trains going around my oval in my necessary counterclockwise direction, and yet I want to build up a train from the ladder tracks here and get that ready to go out onto the oval, and then while that train's ready to go out, pull the other train in or back the other train in and put that into one of the ladder tracks and then pull my new train out. But in order to do that, I'm going to block the outside oval as I'm doing all of my switching moves. Therefore, I really can't have a train running on the oval while I'm building up a train. I have no choice but to, I can run a train on the inside oval, but any switching move is going to require tying up the entire outside oval in order to do it. So this little section of track right here would be called the yard lead, the entrance into the yard. And the solution to this problem is have a bigger yard lead so that you can pull trains out of the yard onto the yard lead without fouling your main line. Now let's address the other problem, and that's that if we're going around our oval in a clockwise direction, when I pull a train in here, I can't get the locomotive out. The entire train is now trapped because the locomotive is trapped. How can I avoid trapping the locomotive? So I've got to have some system in here for running around the train so that I can get the locomotive off of it if I'm going to run around the oval in the opposite direction. This is back to that problem we discussed earlier, the difference between a trailing point switch and a facing point switch. In this case, it's a facing point switch, and so the only way that we can get a train in here and then escape with our locomotive is to have some kind of an escape track, some kind of runaround. So here's what I came up with. I didn't actually do this. I came up with a different solution, but this seemed to be one logical way, and that's that I could pull a train directly into my longest track at the top of the yard here, go through this little crossover onto the next track, and then back my locomotive out, tag onto the back end of the train, and now while fouling my main line again, pull the whole thing back out, and then I could shove the train into whichever track I wanted to, or parts of the train into whichever track I wanted to. So it seemed like a pretty elegant solution, except for the fact that I've just tied up my two best tracks for destination. I've got a track just for trains to pull into that has to be left empty, and then I've got another track that has to be left empty as a runaround for the locomotive. So here's the next idea I came up with, much more elegant, and that's to put in a parallel track to the ladder track that I can use as a runaround. The ladder track has to be left empty at all times anyway, so why not use that as my destination and then just lay a parallel track to it for my runaround so that I can pull my locomotive out, and then again, while completely fouling the main line, pull the train back out of the ladder track and then put the cars in whichever track I want to, thereby not tying up my two longest tracks. I can put a lovely passenger train back there. And another fun feature is this new passing track laying parallel to the ladder track can also have switches on it. And so in this case, I set up a locomotive storage area down here and a little locomotive facility, and then that could be easily expanded into multiple tracks. This new passing track can also function as its own little ladder track, if you will. Now let's keep in mind all of this existed mostly in my mind, with also a few scribbles on paper to work out spacing and that sort of thing. And this is when it hit me, the ultimate solution to this problem. And I lifted all the structures off the railroad, tore up all the track, flipped the plywood over, got a saber saw, and built myself a dog bone railroad. So now I had some lovely little industrial setouts and all kinds of fun things I could do, except I was back to the problem of not having any place to park my 30 blue box Athearn cars. But it is a much better track plan, of course, and a lot of times the best solution to a problem is give up and start over. But the lessons learned from the failed stub end yard still apply. First off, a yard lead. I don't care what kind of yard you're creating, double-ended, classification yard or whatever it is. The yard lead where you're going to be bringing the trains in off of the main line needs to be at least as long as the longest track in your yard, because that's also going to set the longest train that you can pull in here. Moreover, you're going to have some kind of runaround capability. Even with a double-ended yard, you're still going to want to be able to pull your locomotive or locomotives off the head end of the train, get out around your train, and place those locomotives in their own facility somewhere. And this poses a very fun and interesting challenge in designing your track plan. A lot of times this runaround may be part of the main line, where the main line passes alongside the switching yard or something like that. It's really fun to figure out exactly how you're going to go about this in a very fun and interesting way. And so every track plan that you come up with and yard that's going to be applied to that railroad is going to pose a slightly different challenge. You simply need to keep in mind the goal here and make sure that you're planning this out so that you can pull trains into your classification yard, out of your classification yard, move your locomotives off of the train and into their own facility, and maybe even have a different locomotive come in and start switching the cars and placing them in your classification tracks. Or in the case of what I was trying to do here, simply store the the cars so that you can use them later on your railroad. And now that we've moved on to large scale, number 1 gauge, the storage yard, it was the very first thing I built on the railroad because I needed to have someplace to set my cars as I built them, or weathered them and detailed them or whatever. And so because large scale takes up so much space, my storage yard is a stub end yard like this with a single ladder track and a little runaround on the longest tracks, and those tracks are quite often occupied with stuff that's stored, so it involves moving things around a great deal. But at least I can store all my cars because I'm now down to only having about 15 cars, and so it's much easier to store them. At any rate, lessons learned, and lessons learned should equal fun that you're going to have and fun that you have had. So hopefully the information presented here will assist you in designing something fun and interesting on your own model railroad. And we will be continuing the discussion on the Tuesday show, more ideas about track planning. And then, of course, there's the Sunday show, which is completely different, where Karen and I go off on various adventures. And you would certainly want to follow along with all of that, I hope. And so the easy way to be notified every time we upload a video is by subscribing to the channel. Also, subscribing really helps us out. It helps the channel advance. So please subscribe. And the easy peasy way to do that is by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And Karen and I will see you here on Sunday. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.